One of the most brilliant minds in psychology stands at the edge of sanity, deliberately pushing himself into what he calls my most difficult experiment. Carl Jung, the man who helped us understand the human psyche, is about to do something that would terrify most people. He's going to let himself fall, not physically, but mentally, spiritually, into the depths of his own unconscious mind. And what he finds there will change psychology forever. But here's the thing nobody tells you. Jung didn't just stumble into this journey. He chose it. After his devastating break with Sigmund Freud in 1913, Jung felt like his entire world was collapsing. The professional relationship that defined his career was gone. His reputation was at stake. And something darker was happening inside him. He was hearing voices, seeing visions, experiencing what most people would call a mental breakdown. Except Jung made a choice that sounds absolutely insane. Instead of fighting these visions, instead of pushing them away, he decided to go deeper into them. He would document everything. Every strange image, every terrifying figure, every conversation with beings that didn't exist. And he would do it all in a book that he kept hidden from the world for decades. That book is a red book, and it's one of the most haunting, beautiful, and disturbing documents ever created by a psychologist. Now, before we go any further, you need to understand something crucial about Jung's state of mind. This wasn't some peaceful meditation practice. This wasn't guided visualization or lucid dreaming. Jung was genuinely afraid he was going insane. He writes about feeling like he was living in a constant state of tension and worried he was developing psychosis. His children noticed he was different. His wife noticed he was different. And Jung himself wasn't sure he would make it back. But why would someone do this? Why would a respected psychiatrist deliberately court madness? Because Jung believed in something radical. He believed the unconscious wasn't just a garbage dump of repressed memories and sexual desires, like Freud thought. No, Jung believed the unconscious was more like an ocean, vast and alive with its own intelligence, its own purposes, its own inhabitants. And if you could learn to navigate that ocean, if you could learn to communicate with what lived there, you might discover truths about human nature that have been hidden for thousands of years. So in 1913, Jung began what he called his confrontation with the unconscious. Every day, he would enter into a kind of active imagination, a state where he remained conscious, but allowed unconscious images to arise. And what arose was nothing short of extraordinary. The first vision hit him like a freight train. He saw a flood covering all the northern lands between the North Sea and the Alps. He saw civilization drowning, bodies floating, a sea of blood. This vision came to him repeatedly in the spring and fall of 1913. And then, just a few months later, World War I broke out. Jung couldn't shake the feeling that somehow his unconscious had seen it coming. But the visions didn't stop there. They got weirder, much weirder. Jung encountered a figure he called Philemon, an old man with the wings of a kingfisher and the horns of a bull. Now listen carefully to what Jung says about Philemon, because this is where things get really interesting. Jung writes that Philemon seemed to me quite real, as if he were a living personality. He would walk in his garden and talk to Philemon as if he were actually there. Philemon taught Jung about the reality of the psyche, about how thoughts and mental images could have just as much reality as physical objects. Think about that for a second. One of the founders of modern psychology is having full conversations with a winged old man who only he can see. And instead of checking himself into a hospital, he's taking notes, asking questions, learning from this figure. And Philemon wasn't alone. Jung encountered dozens of figures in his unconscious. There was Salome, a blind prophetess who represented the erotic element. There was Elijah, the prophet. There was a black serpent. There was a red one, a devil figure who challenged Jung's Christianity. There was Ka, an Egyptian soul. The list goes on and on. Now, here's where it gets even more fascinating. Jung didn't treat these figures as mere symbols or projections of his own mind. He engaged with them as if they were real, autonomous beings with their own intelligence and will. He would argue with them, learn from them, sometimes be terrified by them. And through these encounters, Jung began to develop ideas that would become central to his psychology, the concept of the collective unconscious, the idea of archetypes. the shadow, the anima and animus. All of these concepts that millions of people now use to understand themselves, they all came from Jung's descent into his own psyche during this period. But let's talk about the book itself, because the Red Book isn't just a diary. It's a work of art that took Jung 16 years to complete. After his daily sessions of active imagination, where he would let these visions emerge, Jung would first write down what he experienced in a series of black journals, just getting the words down, raw and unfiltered. But then, he did something extraordinary. He decided to create an illuminated manuscript, like the monks of the Middle Ages. He wanted to give these visions the gravity they deserved. So Jung bought a large red leather-bound volume, and he began to transcribe his experiences into it, writing in an elaborate Gothic script. And then he painted. My God, did he paint! Jung created dozens of intricate, symbolic illustrations throughout the book. Mandalas, strange figures, cosmic landscapes, geometric patterns. Each image is dense with meaning, layered with symbols from Christianity, Gnosticism, alchemy, and Eastern religions. The Red Book is massive, over 200 calligraph pages. The thing weighs almost 10 pounds. And Jung kept it mostly hidden for his entire life. His family kept it hidden for decades after his death. It wasn't until 2009, 48 years after Jung died, that the Red Book was finally published. Why did Jung hide it? Well, imagine you're a respected scientist, and you've written a book about conversations with biblical prophets and devil figures and Egyptian souls. You can understand the hesitation. Jung himself called it my most difficult experiment. He knew how it would look. He knew people would question his sanity. But here's what's crucial to understand. Jung didn't think he was crazy. He thought everyone else was missing something fundamental about human nature. He believed that the unconscious was real, that archetypes were real, not just metaphors, but actual patterns that structure human experience. And he believed that most people live their entire lives without ever really encountering the depths of their own psyche. Let me read you something Jung wrote in the Red Book, and I want you to really listen to this. I have learned that in addition to the spirit of this time, there is still another spirit at work, namely the spirit of the depths. The spirit of this time prefers to concern itself with surfaces, whereas the spirit of the depths drills down into the infinite. That's the key right there. Jung felt like modern life keeps us on the surface, keeps us distracted, keeps us from the deep work of encountering who we really are. And the Red Book was his attempt to chart the territory of the depths. Now, one of the most powerful sequences in the Red Book involves Jung's encounter with his own shadow. The shadow, in Jungian psychology, represents all the parts of ourselves that we reject, deny, or refuse to acknowledge. It's not just the bad parts. It's anything we've disowned about ourselves. Jung describes descending into a dark cave, going deeper and deeper underground. He encounters a red devil figure who challenges everything Jung believes about good and evil. The devil tells him that Christianity's separation of good and evil is artificial, that wholeness requires integrating both. Jung is horrified by this. He's a pastor's son, steeped in Christian morality. But the figure keeps pushing him, forcing him to confront his own capacity for evil, his own darkness. And here's where Jung has a breakthrough. He realizes that becoming whole, becoming individuated as he calls it, doesn't mean becoming purely good. It means becoming conscious of all the parts of yourself, including the parts you'd rather not acknowledge. The saint and the sinner aren't opposites. They're two sides of the same psyche. This might sound obvious now, but in Jung's time, this was revolutionary. Freud had talked about repression, sure, but Jung was saying something different. He was saying you need to actually dialogue with your darkness, integrate it, make it conscious, not act it out, but own it as part of who you are. Throughout the Red Book, Jung wrestles with this integration. He encounters figures that represent different aspects of his psyche. The wise old man, the seductive woman, the warrior, the child. Each one teaches him something. Each one represents a piece of the whole. And then there are the mandalas. Jung became obsessed with mandalas during this period. He would draw circular designs, geometric patterns, symbols of wholeness. He discovered that these mandalas appeared in cultures all over the world, in Buddhism, in Christianity, in indigenous traditions. He began to see them as archetypal images of the self, the organizing principle of the psyche. Here's something that blew my mind when I learned about it. Jung would draw a mandala every morning in his journal, and he noticed that the images changed depending on his psychological state. The mandala was like a mirror of his inner world, and he began to use mandala creation as a form of therapy, encouraging his patients to draw their own mandalas as a way of connecting with their unconscious. But let's get back to the big question. Was Jung actually descending into the unconscious, or was he having a psychotic break? Was any of this real, or was it all just a brilliant mind coming apart at the seams? Jung himself struggled with this question. He writes in the Red Book about the constant fear that he was losing his grip on reality. He would test himself, making sure he could still function in the world, still see his patients, still be a father and husband. And he could. That's what's so strange about this whole period. Jung was simultaneously exploring the depths of madness and maintaining his professional life. Some Jung scholars argue that what Jung experienced was a creative illness, a psychological crisis that led to profound insights. Others suggest he may have been experiencing a form of dissociation, or even psychosis. Still others believe Jung was pioneering a new kind of psychological exploration, something between therapy, spirituality, and art. The truth is probably more complex than any single explanation. Jung was doing something that few people have ever attempted. He was deliberately loosening his ego's grip on consciousness to see what else was there. And what he found was a rich, symbolic world that seemed to follow its own logic, its own rules. One of the most chilling parts of the Red Book is when Jung encounters what he calls the spirit of the times versus the spirit of the depths. The spirit of the times is everything we value in modern life: progress, science, rationality, achievement. But the spirit of the depths is something older, something that speaks in symbols and myths, something that connects us to the eternal patterns of human experience. Jung felt like modern humanity had become one-sided, over-identified with the spirit of the times and cut off from the spirit of the depths. And he believed this disconnection was causing a kind of spiritual sickness in people. We have all this external progress, all this technology and knowledge, but we've lost touch with the soul. Listen to this passage in the Red Book. The wealth of the soul exists in images, not in concepts, not in rational thought, but in images. Jung believed that the unconscious communicates through symbols, through stories, through mythological patterns that repeat across cultures and throughout history. This is why Jung became so interested in mythology, alchemy, Gnosticism, and world religions. He wasn't just being eclectic or New Agey. He was looking for the universal patterns, the archetypal images that show up everywhere humans have tried to understand themselves and the cosmos. And here's something really important to understand about Jung's method. He wasn't passive in these visions. He wasn't just watching them unfold. He was actively engaging with the figures he encountered. He would argue with them, question them, challenge them. This is what he called active imagination, and it's different from just daydreaming or fantasizing. In active imagination, you maintain a kind of double consciousness. Part of you is experiencing the vision, engaging with the unconscious figures, but part of you remains aware that you're doing this. You're not lost in the experience. You're in dialogue with it. Jung taught this technique to his patients, and it became a central part of Jungian therapy. The idea is that by personifying different aspects of your psyche and engaging with them consciously, you can integrate parts of yourself that were previously unconscious. You can heal splits in your personality. You can become more whole. But let's talk about something that makes people really uncomfortable about the Red Book. Jung didn't just encounter psychological symbols. He encountered religious figures, prophets, gods, and he took them seriously. There's a scene in the Red Book where Jung has a vision of Christ on the cross. But when he looks closer, he sees that the figure is actually him. He's crucified on the tree of life. This terrified Jung. It felt blasphemous, but it also felt deeply true. He was experiencing what mystics have described for centuries: the union of a human and the divine, the death of the ego so something larger can be born. Jung's Christianity was never orthodox after this. He couldn't go back to a simple belief in an external God. Instead, he began to see God as something that also existed within the psyche, an archetype of the self, the image of wholeness and totality. This didn't make him an atheist. If anything, it made the divine more real to him, more immediate, more alive. But you can imagine how this went over with religious authorities. Jung was accused of being a Gnostic, a heretic, of reducing God to a psychological projection. Jung's response was essentially, I'm not saying God is only psychological. I'm saying the only way we can encounter God is through the psyche. The psyche is real. The experiences are real. Whether there's something beyond the psyche, I can't say. But I can study what happens in the psyche when people encounter the divine. This is classic Jung. He always positioned himself at the boundary between science and mysticism, trying to take spiritual experiences seriously while also studying them psychologically. It made scientists uncomfortable because he took religion too seriously. It made religious people uncomfortable because he treated God as a psychological phenomenon. Throughout the Red Book, Jung documents his confrontation with these ultimate questions. Who am I? What is the soul? What is my relationship to God? What does it mean to be whole? These aren't abstract philosophical questions for Jung. They're lived experiences, encounters with forces in his psyche that feel more powerful than his conscious ego. And here's something that really struck me about the Red Book. Jung's writing style changes throughout. Sometimes he's writing in his own voice, analyzing what he's experiencing. But other times, the figures themselves seem to be speaking through him. The text shifts into prophetic mode, with long speeches from Philemon or the Red One or other characters. It's like Jung is channeling something. And before you dismiss that as woo-woo nonsense, consider this. Every artist, every writer, every creative person knows the experience of feeling like something is coming through you rather than from you. You sit down to write or paint or compose, and sometimes it flows in a way that surprises you, that seems to come from somewhere beyond your conscious intention. Jung was experiencing this on steroids. He was opening himself to the creative depths of the unconscious and allowing it to speak. And what spoke was a vision of human psychology that was richer, stranger, and more mysterious than anything that had come before. Now, one of the most important concepts that emerges from the Red Book is what Jung calls individuation. This is a process of becoming your true self, of integrating all the different parts of your psyche into a unified whole. It's not about perfection. It's about wholeness. And wholeness means including everything, even the dark parts, even the parts that don't fit your self-image. Jung describes individuation as a kind of alchemical process. In medieval alchemy, practitioners try to transform base metals into gold. Jung realized that alchemy was actually a symbolic system for psychological transformation. The alchemists were projecting their inner processes onto matter, trying to transform the base elements of the psyche into something precious and whole. The Red Book is full of alchemical imagery, descents into darkness, dismemberment and reintegration, the union of opposites, the creation of philosopher's stone. Jung is using these ancient symbols to map his own psychological transformation. And here's what's really interesting. Jung noticed that his patients would spontaneously produce similar symbols in their dreams and artwork, even if they knew nothing about alchemy. The images were emerging from the collective unconscious, the deeper layer of the psyche that contains patterns shared by all humans. This was Jung's big departure from Freud. Freud thought the unconscious was personal, filled with your individual repressions and traumas. Jung agreed that there was a personal unconscious, but he believed there was something deeper, a collective unconscious shared by all humanity, containing archetypes, universal patterns that shape human experience. The mother, the father, the hero, the trickster, the wise old man, the shadow. These aren't just roles or metaphors. They're psychological structures, patterns of behavior and experience that repeat across cultures and throughout history. They show up in myths, in dreams, in visions, in art. And according to Jung, they're real. Now, does that mean archetypes exist somewhere out there in the universe? Jung wouldn't quite say that, but he also wouldn't say they're just in our heads. He preferred to say they're psychologically real, meaning they have effects, they shape experience. They can't be reduced to something else. This is vintage Jung, always dancing on the edge between psychology and metaphysics, between science and mystery. It frustrated his critics, but it also opened up possibilities that other psychologists missed. Let's talk about one of the darkest parts of the Red Book. Jung encounters what he calls the murders of a hero. In this vision, Siegfried, the hero from Germanic mythology, is killed. Jung himself is the one who kills him. And Jung wakes up feeling horrified, guilty, sure that he's going to be arrested for murder. But then he realizes what this means psychologically. Siegfried represents a heroic ego, the part of us that wants to conquer, achieve, prove ourselves. Jung was killing his own identification with the hero. He was letting go of the drive to be special, important, better than others. He was descending from the heights of achievement into the valley of humility. This was terrifying for Jung because his entire identity was built on being brilliant, accomplished, the chosen successor to Freud. But the unconscious was demanding something different. It was demanding that he stop trying to be a hero and start becoming a whole human being. This is one of the core insights of the Red Book. The ego has to die, metaphorically, for the self to be born. The self with a capital S is Jung's term for the totality of the psyche, the organizing center that's larger than the ego. Individuation isn't about making your ego stronger. It's about relativizing the ego, putting it in service to something larger. Throughout the Red Book, Jung keeps encountering the limits of his ego. He meets figures that humble him, terrify him, show him how small his conscious understanding really is. And through this process, he begins to develop a different relationship with his psyche. Instead of the ego being the commander, it becomes more like a diplomat, negotiating between consciousness and the unconscious. Try to bring them into relationship. One of the most beautiful sections of the Red Book is called The Way of What Is to Come. Jung describes it as the integration of opposites, the marriage of heaven and hell, the union of spirit and matter. He's describing a vision of wholeness that includes everything, rejects nothing, finds the divine not in perfection, but in completeness. This is why Jung was so critical of Christianity's emphasis on good versus evil. He thought it created a split in the psyche, where we identify with the good and project our darkness on others. The result is shadow projection, where we see in others what we can't acknowledge in ourselves. Hitler, the devil, the enemy, they become containers for our disowned darkness. Jung believed that if more people did the work of integrating their shadow, of owning their capacity for evil, there would be less collective violence. Because when you know your own darkness, when you've looked in the face and integrated it consciously, you're less likely to be possessed by it, less likely to act it out unconsciously. This is heavy stuff, but Jung wasn't being theoretical. He was riding in the shadow of World War I, watching Europe tear itself apart, and he would live to see World War II and the Holocaust. Jung became convinced that these collective catastrophes were manifestations of the unconscious shadow of Western civilization, all the darkness we couldn't acknowledge erupting in mass violence. The Red Book is partly a warning. Jung is saying, look at what happens when we ignore the unconscious, when we repress the depths, when we think we're purely rational and enlightened. The shadow doesn't go away. It just grows more powerful in the dark, and eventually it erupts. But the Red Book is also a map. Jung is showing us that there's another way. You can consciously engage with the unconscious. You can learn its language, meet its inhabitants, integrate its wisdom. It's dangerous, it's difficult, but it's possible, and it might be necessary for both individual and collective healing. Near the end of his life, Jung said something profound about the Red Book. He said it contained everything that came after. All his books, all his theories, all his clinical work. It all flowed from those years of confrontation with the unconscious. The Red Book was the source, the wellspring, the foundation. But he also said he couldn't have published it during his lifetime. People weren't ready. Psychology wasn't ready. He needed to translate the experiences into concepts, into theories, into language that the scientific community could engage with. The Red Book was too raw, too strange, too obviously the work of someone walking the edge between genius and madness. And maybe he was right. When the Red Book was finally published in 2009, the reactions were intense. Some people saw it as Jung's masterpiece, the key to understanding his entire psychology. Others saw it as evidence that Jung had actually been psychotic, that his theories were built on a foundation of delusion. Still others found it beautiful and terrifying and profound in ways they couldn't quite articulate. But here's what I think is most important about the Red Book. It's not a book you read for information. It's a book that invites you into an experience. Jung isn't asking you to believe his visions. He's showing you what happens when someone takes the unconscious seriously, when someone has the courage to descend into the depths and document what they find there. And in that sense, the Red Book is an invitation. Jung is saying you have depths too. You have an unconscious that's alive with images and figures and wisdom. Most people never explore it. They live on the surface, distracted by the spirit of the times, never touching the spirit of the depths. But you could make a different choice. You could, like Jung, choose to turn inward, to face the chaos and creativity of your own psyche, to engage in a work of becoming whole. It won't be safe. It won't be comfortable. Jung himself barely made it through. But on the other side of that confrontation might be something invaluable, a relationship with the totality of who you are. The Red Book ends with Jung having integrated many of his unconscious contents. He's not finished. Individuation is a lifelong process, but he's found a kind of equilibrium. The ego and the unconscious are in dialogue. The spirit of the times and the spirit of the depths have found a relationship. Jung has become more whole, and he's left us this record, this strange and beautiful testament to one man's journey into the unknown territories of the psyche. It's part autobiography, part mythology, part psychological treatise, part work of art. It defies easy categorization, which is probably exactly what Jung intended, because the unconscious doesn't fit into categories. It's too fluid, too alive, too creative. It speaks in symbols and paradoxes. It shows us things we don't want to see and reveals beauty we didn't know existed. It's the source of both our darkest shadows and our most profound wisdom. Jung spent 16 years creating the Red Book, and his family kept it hidden for decades after his death. But now it's out in the world, available to anyone brave enough to engage with it. And maybe that's the gift Jung left us. Not a prescription for how to live, not a set of beliefs to adopt, but a map of the territory he explored and an invitation to explore our own. The question Jung leaves us with is simple but profound. Are you willing to look into your own depths? Are you willing to encounter the unknown within yourself? Are you willing to have your comfortable self-image shattered so something larger can emerge? Jung did it. He descended into what looked like madness and emerged with new vision of what it means to be human. He paid a tremendous price for that knowledge. Years of uncertainty, fear, professional risk. But he also discovered something that gave his life meaning and depth that most people never find. The Red Book sits there, a testament to one man's courage to face the unknown. And it asks us, what about you? What's waiting in your depths? What figures want to speak to you? What wholeness is trying to emerge? Jung believed that the unconscious is a purpose that is trying to bring us toward wholeness, toward individuation, toward becoming who we really are. But it can't do that without our conscious cooperation. We have to meet it halfway. We have to be willing to listen, to engage, to integrate. That's the real message of the Red Book. You're not just an ego, not just a conscious mind. You're a vast psyche, mostly unconscious, full of potential and shadow and wisdom. And the work of being human is bringing all of that into consciousness, making a whole, living from that totality rather than from the tiny island of the ego. It's terrifying work. Jung knew that better than anyone. But it's also the most meaningful work we can do, because in becoming whole, we not only heal ourselves, we stop projecting our unconscious contents onto the world. We become conscious carriers of psychic energy rather than unconscious instruments of forces we don't understand. Jung's Red Book remains one of the most fascinating documents in the history of psychology. It's a reminder that the psyche is stranger and more wonderful than any theory can capture. It's an invitation to take your inner life seriously, to treat it as real and important and worthy of exploration. And it's a warning about what happens when we ignore the depths, when we live only on the surface, when we think consciousness is all there is. So what do you do with all this? Maybe you can't spend years in active imagination like Jung did. Maybe you don't want to court the edge of madness. But you can pay attention to your dreams. You can notice the symbols that recur in your life. You can ask what parts of yourself you disown, what shadows you project onto others. You can begin, even in small ways, to have a relationship with your unconscious. That's Jung's legacy. Not a completed system, not a fixed set of beliefs, but an ongoing dialogue between consciousness and the unconscious, between ego and self, between the known and the unknown. The Red Book is a record of how one man undertook that dialogue at the deepest level. And it stands as an eternal invitation for others to begin their own descent into the depths, their own confrontation with the unconscious, their own journey toward wholeness.